Hello everybody, this weekend we are answering one of the classic pub debates, entry-level 911 or well-specified Cayman. In yesterday's video I drove this base 992 Carrera, and now we're going to be taking out its smaller sibling, the Cayman GTS 4.0L. £10,000 separates these two cars, the Cayman being the cheaper one despite a very generous specification. But is it as good on the road as it is on paper? So before we find out, let's just remind you what this car is all about. For an awfully long time, Porsche seemed to want to do everything in its power to make sure there was clear ground between the Cayman and its top dog sports car, the 911. Cars like the Cayman R seem to be a very half-hearted approach, a sort of, well, there you go, have that. Even though that was actually an excellent car, it still fell some short of the potential everybody knew was in the Cayman chassis. Then, a few years ago, they shocked us all with the Cayman GT4, the car they said they would never build, a Cayman with a 911 engine in it. And, predictably, it was brilliant. However, it was also very hard to get a hold of, with prices of those now only just about coming back down to what they should have been at list when new. The 718 generation then followed, and it seemed like the Cayman really was no longer the car for the sports enthusiast, because out went the naturally aspirated six-cylinder engine and in came a turbocharged flat 4. Now, the Carrera at the same time also got turbocharged, but it kept 6 cylinders, and I have to say I actually quite liked the 991.2's turbo engine. Then Porsche brought out the new 718 GT4, and once again a big surprise because it had in it a 4-litre, mostly new engine derived from the 3-litre turbocharged unit in the Carrera, except this time with no turbos on it. A fantastic engine, but again, only available in limited edition cars, the Boxster Spider and Cayman GT4. So what were you to do if you wanted a nice, sporty, reasonably affordable Porsche sports car with 6 cylinders in, and you didn't want to do unspeakable things to get a hold of one? Well, this is the answer, because Porsche surprised us all for another time when they introduced this, the Cayman GTS 4.0L. It seems that even Porsche was not unaware of the fact that the 4-cylinder Boxster was not universally loved. So this exists now as the car for those who want their old school Caymans back. And despite the fact it's not a flagship GT car, they really didn't skimp on the specification with the GTS 4.0L. You actually have 15 horsepower more than in this base Carrera, 400 plus 385. Despite the lack of turbochargers, the torque deficit is also minimal, only 30 Newton meters or 22 pound-foot less. This car also has even bigger brakes than the 911, 350mm at the front with 6-pot calipers versus 330mm with 4-pot calipers. You of course have that mid-engine layout, which means you've lost the back seats, but you do gain lowered PASM as standard, Porsche torque vectoring as standard, even dynamic gearbox mount as standard. These are a pretty well specified car out of the gates, but naturally, this being a press car, Porsche didn't stop there. This wonderful Python green paint is £1,600, I would say, rather well spent. But more confusing is the interior specification. And here Porsche have continued a tradition that frustrates the living daylights out of me. This has had £2,000 spent on it on what they call the GTS interior. Now, tell me in the comments if you agree with me, but surely a car which is the GTS should come with the GTS interior as standard. I don't even actually know what that really gets you, presumably some extra bits of leather and stuff like that. Even more confusingly is the fact that on top of that £2,000, more than 1,200 quid is then spent on crayon GTS interior, which I've not really discovered what that's actually done. We think the seatbelts and the stitching. That's very expensive seatbelt and stitching at over 1,200 quid. And the rest of the spec has been made up of all of the usual Porsche suspects, Bose and a whole heap of things that really should be standard on a 65 grand car. Parking sensors, cruise control, all that sort of stuff. You have Sports Plus seats here, which are manual, and generally speaking, I'd say this is actually a pretty realistic representation of the kind of thing that people are going to spec when they're ordering their Cayman GTS. So, does it deliver the driving experience that I felt was missing from the 911? Let's find out. So here we are in the Cayman. Now in real terms it's only been about 5 minutes since I hopped out of the 992, so I can give you the most accurate, freshest impression of the difference between the two. The first is that the moment you get into this, you do feel like you're getting into a car that's a little bit older, but actually that feels equally as nice. There's still plenty of leather in here, contrast stitching, bits of carbon fibre trim. This is a lovely place to be, and it does feel perhaps a little bit more traditional sports car. It feels much more compact, more intimate than in the 911. Visibility is still good, and of course it's nice to have this manual gear lever down here too. You have a number of different driving modes, of course, as you do in the 911, and you've got the little dial down here thanks to the fact you've got the Sport Chrono Pack. Oh, you turn it around to Sport and the throttle becomes a lot snappier. In fact, it just threw me forward there when I pressed it. Gear shift throw is fairly precise, quite short, and you have only the 6 ratios to choose from versus the 8 in the 911. Pedals are quite light, controls are all quite easy, and that includes the steering too. This feels noticeably firmer than the 911 over the little imperfections you've got on the road surface. Even those little joins in the road where 2 pieces of tarmac meet are much more pronounced in this. Oh yeah, as are the potholes and things. It's not a bad ride. It doesn't seem anywhere near as stiff at low speeds as the Boxster Spider that I drove, which shares its componentry with the GT4 Cayman, and overall the first impressions are reasonably positive, if not spectacular. At idle, this thing actually does make quite a nice noise if you put your foot on the loud pedal and try and show off, but the moment you're on the move it quietens quite considerably, and I have the exhaust in its sporty setting. Let's just test at low speed the suspension in its sporty mode. Oh yeah, instantly. In fact, I didn't even realise this road wasn't perfectly smooth, but now I know that it is. The car is actually sort of wobbling as it moves down the road. It's really quite disconcerting. It feels very unnatural. That is going straight off, because this is not the right mode for the road that's about to come up. One thing I'd say about this dash is it's actually something of a shame that despite it only having 3 screens, there's not a lot of information here. One of them is digital, and one is the speedo, which in Porsche tradition, since I think the 996, is in 25-mile-an-hour increments, meaning it's pretty much completely useless. So 1/3 of your dash is given over to a dial that you can't really read that easily. This car and myself are currently champing at the bit because we're presently stuck behind a van which is intent on going fairly slowly, and this car is not really difficult to drive around town or at low speeds, but it's not particularly happy doing it. Not as stiff, I think, as the Spider, but it's still a fairly harsh ride. And now we have the road clear, so let's see what she can do. Makes a lovely sound when pressing on. Real classic flat 6 roar comes into the cabin and finally seems to come alive, the car. It's certainly not slow. Actually doesn't seem like it's lacking for mid-range punch, which is surprising having just got out of the 911. But I think that tells you more than anything just how much Porsche have pegged that car back in terms of performance. That engine wants to make an awful lot more power and torque than this does. It is a somewhat jittery car, this. The chassis feels a little bit uneasy. And the steering isn't really improving that much. We're going to push harder in some tighter corners, see if it can come alive. I'd say it's given me just a touch more feel than the 911s, but not really masses more. This car certainly feels much more at home on these roads than the 911, if only for the size difference and nothing else. You feel like you're a little bit closer to the road, a little bit more connected. You are somewhat more cab forward in this car too, and it does really make a difference. It does inspire a little bit more confidence, I would say. Gearbox is really quite nice. Traction feels decent in normal mode. James reported a lot of issues with traction in this car. Maybe he was driving in Sport, perhaps it's a little bit looser there. Oh, they're in Sport Plus now. Let's just go for it, shall we? Whoa, throttle's really super responsive in Sport Plus. A bit too much, I would say. I've no issues with the pace in this car. It can devour this road quite happily. I'd say it certainly is a little bit more compliant in the damping than the Boxster Spider, but it's not a night and day difference. It's still a firm car. Pull from low down, about 2,000 RPM, is pretty decent. However, once again, steering feel just isn't very good. A classic Porsche strong point, and they've just failed here. I don't know how either, because Porsche made the transition to electric steering, actually, I'd say, much more successfully than most other brands. The 991.1 GT3 was superb. Right, let's do my little 3-point turn on a hill start test. Oh, this thing actually does rev matching too. I wonder if that's a Sport Plus thing. Visibility's not so bad. Oh, no reversing camera in this car. And up we get. Yeah, not too bad, that. Car's actually starting to skip a little bit as we're picking up speed. I was hoping that as you pile on the speed, the car would suddenly find its rhythm. You do have a lot of vehicles like that. So today, for example, we drove up in James's Aston Martin V8 Vantage N430. Perhaps that's not done us any favours, because that really is an excellent car in many ways. But one of its flaws is that it too is a little bit firm at low speeds. In fact, I'd say firmer than this, sort of sub 30 mile an hour. But once you get that car to about sort of 40, 50 and you start pressing on, it really does make an awful lot of sense. This never does. In fact, it gets a little bit worse because the car seems to start jumping around the place. Reminds me of my old 996 on its MO30 suspension. Yeah, just wriggling at the back. The 911 took this road much more in its stride, and that steering absolutely refuses to talk to me. Oh, actually, putting it in sport mode, now trying to heel and tow. I find the throttle too sensitive. It is an excellent engine, this, it must be said. The car really does egg you on, but it doesn't reward for your extra pace at all. In fact, it starts to punish because it starts to get a bit squirrely. Actually, I can feel the rear there just starting to want to break away. It's very cold on these roads, and actually quite mixed, so certain corners have a lot more traction than others. Brakes I've no issue with at all, they're really excellent. Good feel through the pedal. In Porsche tradition, this car is actually geared really long too. So let's find out what this engine's characteristics are really like. Let's slow it right back down, take it back down to second, so we can show you what that'll do. So it's strong through third, fourth, 5,000 RPM. Oh, second gear, it's really struggling for traction in a straight line in second gear, which will take you to sort of the speed limit and a little bit more on this road. And the car is having a hard time. Got proper mechanical limited slip diff with Porsche torque vectoring and all that jazz in it. And it'll go quick, but it never engages. Some other Caymans I've driven, like for example the Cayman R, they really do come alive, and at quite low speed, sort of 50 mile an hour in some cases. You really feel the car moving under you, and it's a dance that you sort of engage with it. This feels very, very disconnected. I have the impression in this car that were it to go wrong, it's going to go wrong very suddenly and without much warning. Perhaps that's wrong, perhaps that's not the correct assumption, but on account of the fact that I'm not Chris Harris, I'm not going to try and find that out. So which wins then? Not exactly been a great day for Porsche. The last time we came down here, we brought the Taycan and the Cayenne Turbo SE Hybrid, and both performed well above expectations. I think it's fair to say that for James and myself, both the 911 and the Cayman have just fallen a little bit short. I'd say the Cayman is closer to greatness. I have far fewer inherent issues with this, but the suspension just still feels a little bit uneasy. Its normal mode should actually be hardcore, and its hardcore mode, there are plenty of highlights, gearbox, engine, actually makes a good noise from in here if not out there, but the steering being so lifeless is fairly unforgivable. I've driven video games with better steering, and that's no exaggeration. I will say that Unlike in the Toyota GR Yaris, the auto rev match in here actually does work quite well. The Toyota's never quite seems to get it right. I love the looks of the car, and like all Caymans, this remains extremely practical. But as an engaging driver's car, I'm afraid the Cayman GTS also falls some way short of expectations. A better sports car than the 911, but a great Cayman, in my mind, it's not. Anyway, that's another pair of Porsche videos. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.